Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll just wait another minute to make sure that everyone's successfully zoomed in. So while we're waiting, I just wanted to mention the webinar that we ran last week on carbon farming. Rod, would you be able to just change the slide to the carbon farming slide? So basically that webinar covered a lot of information that's likely to be of interest to participants listening today. So if you haven't already watched it, I thoroughly recommend that you do so. So as you can see, you can access it through the Clean Growth Choices website, and it discusses some really tangible benefits for landholders about getting involved in the Queensland Government $500 million emissions reduction fund. So I think we might start now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Making Regenerative Agriculture Work, Learning from Long-Term Practitioners. So I'm Nicole Price from the Clean Growth Choices Consortium, and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. This webinar is actually the fifth in a series of webinars that we're presenting as part of the Communities in Transition program. So it's a Queensland government funded program. And basically it involves 6 regional communities exploring what opportunities they have to help them transition into a more economically and environmentally sustainable future. So the Clean Growth Choices Consortium is made up of the partners that you can see there at the bottom of your screens, and we're assisting the communities in this process. So to be honest, I and the communities in transition are really excited about the opportunities regenerative agriculture offer. And that's not only for the landholders, but also for regional communities and society in general. So of course, while some of the theories and the practices of regenerative agriculture have been around for a long time, it's really only in the last few years in Australia that regenerative agriculture really seems to be getting some traction. And so as a result, we're seeing a real appetite for more information and experience sharing. So with that in mind, I'd like to now introduce Rod Chisholm and Dr. Richard Thackway from the Soils for Life program. Now this program supports innovative landholders that are demonstrating high level performance in regenerative agricultural landscape management. Their stories are really compelling, and we believe that they can really provide confidence for those who are looking into regenerative agriculture and wanting to make a change for the better. So we've got Rod, who's the CEO of the program, and he brings to his position a long history of management and strategy, which he's using to help increase the adoption of regenerative agriculture. And that's not only with landholders, but also really importantly, educators and policymakers that can also assist to drive this change. And we also have Richard on the left there, who's a research scientist. Now, Richard's worked for decades in classifying and assessing and reporting on Australian landscapes, and Richard's going to give us some insights on the Soils for Life case studies. So it's with great pleasure I now hand over to Rod and Richard, who are going to present for about 30 minutes. If you have any questions, please fill out the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll devote about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to answering those questions. So a big welcome, Rod and Richard.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much there. I just want to say to you all, before we get into a discussion about Regen Ag and what is the nature of it, I want to give you a little bit of background to Soils for Life. This organisation was founded about 10 years ago by former Governor-General Michael Jeffrey, or General Jeffrey, as some people call him. And Michael was also appointed by the Gillard government as the National Soils Advocate. And he's just been reconfirmed on the 18th of July by Scott Morrison at the recent Dubbo Bush Summit. Now, he's got a fair level of influence across lots of federal government portfolios, and also the organisation COAG that coordinates between federal government and the states. So finally, we've got someone in a high position in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet who can bring everybody together and try to do away with some of the stovepipes and some of the barriers to recognising that Australia's landscapes are in peril and that we do need something. Now, the Office of the Soil Advocate is separate from Soils for Life, but General Jeffrey is our chairman. And also recently at the Bush Summit, we were given some funding so that we can continue with doing case studies for at least the next 4 years. So between Richard and I, we're going to tell you a bit about where we came from. And one of the case studies we're going to concentrate on and refer to a lot is Duke's Plains, which is up near Theodore. Some of you may be familiar with it. I've only been here about 6 months, but I've heard a lot about this case study, one we're particularly proud of. And Richard, who's been involved here for a long time, will tease out a few lessons, not only in Duke's Plains, but also in other case studies we've done around the countryside. I'd also like to invite Richard just right now to briefly tell us a bit about himself. My background is all in big project management and infrastructure maintenance. Richard is a scientist.
Thank you, Rod. My background, I've worked in CSIRO in the Australian government and have a particular interest in the effect that land management regimes and practices have on the indicators or criteria of the composition of an ecosystem, like its plants and its animals, its function, the soil, carbon, nutrients, water cycling and physical properties, as well as the structure, which is the height, the density, or the lack of it. Things like with increasing grazing pressure, you'll find bare ground becomes prevalent, or inappropriate grazing regimes can lead to the incursion of woody weeds and in instances of thickening. I've got a good background in remote sensing, so where we've got landholders who are willing to participate in a partnership with us, we bring in remote sensing.
So what is regenerative agriculture? It's very much a system of farming principles and practices that does the 4 things you can see on your slide there: improving biodiversity, enriching soil, improving watersheds, and enhancement of ecosystem services. Now, you should really know what all of those 4 things mean, and I'm not going to explain to them now, but you can Google any of them and you will be overwhelmed with information. What we try to focus on is the integration of healthy soil, smart water management, good animal management, sensible, sustainable animal management, and getting good pastures and sensible cropping. So the integration of those 4 things: healthy soil, good water management, smart animal management, and clever management of the pasture and the crops. So we're going to talk about Duke's Plain. Now, there was a good history of what had happened up in this part of the Brigalow country. You can see there on the slide who previously owned it, where it is. The size of it, about 7,000, nearly 8,000 hectares, annual rainfall about 700 mils and an elevation of about 300 metres. Some of the drivers for the adoption of regenerative practices were very much about sustainability, reducing input costs, and improving production. Some of the other drivers are described there in the slide. A lot of it was driven by the desire to adopt a sensible, business-like but holistic view of how the business was operated. Against a background of looming commercial failure, this couple recognised very much that something had to be done about the way they were doing business. And you can see a dozen things there that were driving their desire, a stimulus for change. And I think it was very much having a good hard look at yourself and saying, well, we have to do something. I think most of you know a bit about the history of the Brigalow country and some of the government policies that led to the condition that it's in. And it's not just government policy, it's about some of the practices that drove the behaviours of the people who got land in that part of Australia. Now, how did the Joyces obtain knowledge about regen ag is very much what people do today. A lot of it is self-education, and the great advantage we've all got that they didn't have is the internet. You all know there's a huge amount of information there. They also spent a lot of time questioning their own practices and the practices of people around them. They attended workshops, courses, field days, and engaged a couple of leading edge consultants who we can name later. And Richard knows some people who are very good in the business. Focused a lot on differentiating between symptoms and the causes of the indicators that they were observing. Now, I mentioned that we're lucky in that we got recourse to the internet, and I hope it works reasonably well for all of you. And I know it's very patchy in Australia. But I'm going to ask Richard to talk a little bit about the importance of remote sensing, which is something that's only recently really becoming available to us, and something that Soils for Life is going to adopt wholeheartedly in the prosecution of our case studies in the coming years.
Thanks, Rod. When we're looking at the benefit that remote sensing can bring, we need to look at the scale, which is how the property fits into the broader landscape and the region, and how the property is responding to management and the drivers of climate over the period at which we're interested in doing a case study. And often what that involves is looking at a property for 10 years prior to us writing up a case study. And so remote sensing gives us a very useful indicator of what's happening on the ground. And it obviously must be informed by what the land managers are doing. So we have a conversation with the land managers, and we understand what the composition of their pastures are and how frequently they're grazing, or how frequently they're cropping in a landscape. And we're able to look at and to track things like the amount of bare ground through time, and work with the land managers to see whether they're getting on top of that, and remind them not so much about the big eye in the sky, but using information that's available from satellite imagery to say, are you aware that your stock are overgrazing in a particular part of a paddock? And introduce the idea that you can track change and trend using an understanding of position in the landscape, an understanding of soil landscape types, and an understanding of seasonality. And so that remote sensing gives us an idea of the amount of greenness, the biomass that's on a paddock and feed on offer. It gives us also an understanding of how much dry standing biomass is available, and that will impact the decisions that a land manager makes as far as providing supplements in the way of licks and water medication.
Thanks, Richard. So we've talked about technology, about making a big effort to educate yourselves, but another very important way to get encouragement and mutual support is to build or join regen ag networks such as the one you're in at the moment. You know, none of us is too old or too experienced to learn something new. You know, I came off dairy farms in Victoria as a kid, and what I've learned about agriculture in the last 6 months has been quite extraordinary. And, you know, I'm not exactly young. So, you know, we've always got a lot to learn, and I leave you very much with that message. There's a Regenerative Agriculture Alliance emerging at Southern Cross Uni down in Lismore. That's got a lot of merit. You should have a look into it. I've also mentioned there Terry McCosker and Tarwin Park Training, who are a couple of commercial service providers. Richard, are there any others you can think of?
Yeah, there are lots of regional service providers, and I would suggest the best thing for people to do is to come in through your, so if you're in New South Wales, the local land services, or in Queensland, the CMAs and state governments, are their website to often recommend suppliers with that sort of information.
Just getting back to Soils for Life, some of the things we support are listed there. And these are organisations you should be aware of, and Google all of them and see what they do. Can I just ask the moderator, is this presentation available to everyone after we're finished?
Yes, absolutely, Rod. So they'll be sent a link through email, and then it'll be uploaded on the website as well. So it'll be accessible forever and a day.
Well, if you can, make an effort, everybody, to have a look at those. Let's talk about how farmers read their landscapes. Now, Richard's mentioned some of the wonderful possibilities about remote sensing. And at some other stage, if you want to drop us a line, we can tell you how to access remote sensing at affordable level. And just be aware that in most of the case studies we do, we as an organisation are going to start funding some remote sensing and monitoring of properties over time, so that we have got some data to demonstrate what we have observed and what landholders have observed. Soil testing is a critically important element. As you all probably know, testing for organic carbon is not cheap, and it's not readily evident at scale. And it's terribly important because organic carbon in soil holds water. Melbourne Uni and some of the other research universities are doing wonderful things here at the moment, and over time I'll keep you abreast of that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the photo on the left there, or equally we'll take the photo on the right, but the young fellow on the left, he's a cane farmer and has been a cane farmer for many decades. He's a great supporter of getting soil tests done, and the way he upscales, understands what's happening in the shovel and upscales it to the landscape is through his earthworms. So he doesn't need to do a test every square metre, but what he does is he wanders around and looks at the number of earthworms that he records or observes in a shovel of dirt. And as he's been going on through the years, as you can see that the trend line on that graph goes from 1 to 8.8, he's got lots and lots of earthworms, and that's one of the primary indicators that he uses about the successful outcome of his management.
Thanks, Richard. Some of the innovations that have been implemented at Duke's Plains include a very significant uptake of cell grazing and fairly intensive observation, recording and management. The what and how is mentioned there in dot points. The benefits are manifest and are listed there, with a significant increase in productivity. Native plants are emerging, and the infrastructure investment in fencing and water reticulation was paid off in just 3 years, which is pretty impressive. How cell grazing works, I think a lot of you have a reasonable idea of how it works, and I'm not going to try and give you a lesson in this short time, but please go through the dot points we've got there and read widely on cell grazing. The important thing is it gives pasture a chance to recover. It's also said to impact the behaviour of stock, which is an interesting anecdote I've heard from a couple of people. Richard, have you got anything to add on cell?
Sorry for stumbling there. I'm just trying to think of the word cell grazing often causes land managers to stumble. It's typically used in very high productivity landscapes, that's high rainfall and very productive soils. Whereas in the drier parts, we shouldn't be referring to as cell grazing, we should be referring to it as paddock grazing.
Rotation.
Yeah, paddock rotations. And to go down this route of regenerative pasture managed with long-term rest, each of the paddocks, as Rod's already alluded to, needs to have water put into it. And then the land manager goes around and understands the growth cycle of the plants in the pasture and is able to say whether it's a short-term rotation or in drier times, a much longer rotation.
Some of the innovations that occurred at Duke's Plains are very much about the adoption of biodynamic products tailored to what they'd observed about particularly deficiencies, backed by a certain amount of soil testing, predictably boron and manganese deficient, and there's ways you can improve that. The Joyces developed their own biodynamic preparations and figured out some smart ways of spreading the stuff. Aerial spreading was just far too expensive. What's interesting there is the tea bag innovation of putting biodynamic preparations into water troughs, and these substances go through the gut of stock and end up on the ground without any detriment to the stock. So there's a bit of science behind that, and you've got to be very aware of what you're doing, but I'd encourage you to read the case study. It's online on our site. Most of you know how biodynamic fertilisers work. I've seen not only in Duke's Plain, but particularly in marginal soils in the West Australian wheat belt, some wonderful successes with the adoption of biodynamics and composts, liquid composts, within just 2 years of application. Richard?
It is astounding the variety of methods that landholders come up with and how they use their stock, as one of the points in the previous slide said, as cow tractors. The key thing to remember here is that many of these producers who are adopting these practices are looking for low-cost solutions which are sustainable through time, and solutions which they've got control over.
And equate to reduced input costs.
Yep.
Optimising vegetation became a very big issue on Duke's Plains and certainly throughout most pasture areas. There was quite a significant increase in canopy cover, generated and stimulated a fair bit of revegetation. The thinning and eradication of brigalow, I understand, is stopped altogether, and even to this day. We've got a slide there on how brigalow natural regrowth actually works, and I encourage you to have a look at that and see if you can adopt some of these techniques. Some of them do certainly allow for better growth and increased fodder for cattle under the canopy, and water loss through evaporation is reduced, in some cases quite significantly. Water retention is very much about soil improvements to allow greater penetration of the God-given rainfall. There's a certain amount of land contouring. I think you know the benefits about improving soil carbon matter and the moistures being nicely absorbed in the soil to this day. Some of the barriers I want to talk about, and Richard, please chime in here. There's a great reluctance of overcoming what you might have learned from your own family or from the ag colleges or schools you ever went to. I think you need to have an open mind.
These barriers are present in virtually every enterprise, and the more producers embark on more biologically based farming, the more they get ostracised in their local community. But ultimately, it's the savings that these producers make in their pocket. And it is sad that locally many of these producers are not champions, but you take them outside their region and these producers are on the national speaking tours. So I find that is a fascinating process to watch. The other thing is that there is a skepticism in the scientific community that more biologically based farming enterprises are lacking in credibility. We're finding that if you look at the whole farm and look at production, ecological, social and economic, the proof is multidimensional rather than just a soil test.
So if some of those barriers about, overcoming family or community attitudes are evident where you're from, do link into these communities of practice and get encouragement from your peers. Get onto our social media feeds. Get on to Southern Cross Uni at Lismore's feeds. The very fact that you're in this forum, I would hope, would be giving you some collegiate support. Now, there's a few things here about a bit of advice from the last interview that was done with the landowner here, and I'll ask Richard to tap through some of these, starting with data capture.
So what we find across many of our case studies is that landholders intuitively know about the structure, composition and function of their landscape in response to the way they're managing and in response to temperature increases over seasons or rainfall. But what we find is that many of the producers aren't collecting that data in a systematic and repeated trajectory sense. So we're working with them to use expert elicitation to capture the data that's in their hearts and their minds, and we validate that information using remote sensing. And that is a really powerful endorsement of what they've done, and because we don't bring the remote sensing in until after, so we're looking at a point of time. So we might go onto a property in 2017 and look back over the last 10 years. We write up the case study in partnership with the land manager, and then we'll bring in the remote sensing to validate things like bare ground and biomass and incursion of woody plants and where water is being held higher in the landscape. We can look at enhancing the knowledge of the land manager by bringing in something like vegetation greenness index.
So with our first round of case studies, it was really looking at the state of production and looking at the history. What we intend to do with the second round of case studies, and we're up to about number 25 at the moment, and I've got another 45 queued up, but we are quite committed to generating a baseline of land condition, soil carbon, the old ones of NPK, and we're going to monitor them over time using some of the techniques that Richard has addressed. You know, the days of jotting down everything in little notebooks and putting them in your breast pocket and having 20 of them over 10 years really doesn't cut it anymore. You do need to try and adopt to even things like Excel spreadsheets to try and record, you know, rainfall, temperature, any soil testing you get done, extreme climatic events. We do need to get more sophisticated in the way we do things. Now, in a minute, I'm going to invite questions. I've been given half an hour to talk and we have skated over things pretty quickly. But I want you to know that what we found at Duke's Plains is evident in not just grazing, but in other types of agriculture right across Australia, in sheep grazing, in growing grains, and also in fruit and veg production throughout Australia, not just in the north, but certainly in the coastal regions and in the south, where the majority of our fruit and veg production occurs. We think it's terribly important to recognise that the way we have been undertaking industrial forms of agriculture for the last 100 years just won't cut it for the next 20 or 30 years. We do worry about global food security, about food and water security for Australia. And if you wonder what motivates guys like Richard and I and General Mike Jeffrey, it's very much about trying to make sure that our farming enterprises are sustainable in the years ahead, that we try to address some of the degradation that's occurred, that we try to improve the actual health of soil. And there's, you know, you could have a day-long seminar about that on its own. But that's what motivates us. And we really want to see all of you do well, reduce your inputs, improve your production, and make your own lives probably a bit more stress-free. If you have a look on our website, there's a terrific new case study gone up on a property called Illawong, Illawong, down near Albury. And the landowner there, Brian Harris, gives a great little 5-minute talk on what he's achieved over the years. And the one thing you really do get out of that is not only the sustainability improvements, production improvements, but the impact it's had on his and his family's life in reducing very significantly some of the stresses he used to feel as a younger man, in not only making a quid, but having something he could hand on to his heirs. And Richard, have you got anything you'd like to add in conclusion?
Yeah, one of the points was on the slide, which is we glossed over, is to ensure that if you want to make a difference and see how well you're making a difference, is you need to establish a baseline in the things that are important for your particular enterprise. Soils for Life uses 10 criteria. We're looking at soil nutrients, soil hydrology, soil physical properties. And when we work through those criteria with a landholder, often we'll find that the information that's been collected by the landholder hasn't been put into a system or a way of viewing the world, a framework, if you like. And I'd encourage you to look at establishing a baseline for your enterprise. It may be to do with ground cover management. It may be to do with the cleanliness of water that are available for your stock to drink. So you can use tests at a particular time to say, this is what it was, and look at this, I'm getting the same, or I'm getting better, or as a result of changing summer rainfall to autumn rain, as a landholder, I may need to change my stocking rate at a particular time, or rotate stock at a different time, and you can measure that in different paddocks.
So what it boils down to is making decisions based on facts and the education you've picked up through forums like this. Now, through the moderator, I'll throw it open to questions now. I hope you've found it useful. I encourage you to have a look on our website, and over to you, Nicole.
Thanks very much, Rod and Richard, and really encouraging presentation, thank you. So we've got a few questions. I've got one from Daniel, who's asking, do you have South Australian case studies or more semi-arid case studies lined up?
Short answer is yes, I do. But we haven't, when we get more resources, which I think will be in the next couple of months, the government just announced some funding for us, but we haven't seen the colour of that money just yet. So in time, yes, we're very interested in South Australia. You've got an agriculture minister there and a couple of universities who are very interested in encouraging the adoption of regenerative ag in South Australia. If anyone has got a reference site or a good story, please let me know about it. So Daniel, not in South Australia just now, but I've got a couple lined up.
Yeah, and Daniel, Richard here, one thing I encourage you to do is hop on our website and download the expression of interest, or encourage your friends to download it, and then we can get back in touch with those people who would like to be considered as a potential case study.
Excellent. And I've got similar questions from Don and Katrina. So they're just wondering what's happening in the horticultural space, as they haven't come across a lot of examples.
Well, with Soils for Life, not very much at all. We've tended in the past to concentrate on grazing and cropping and grains. And it's really only since we've had the resources to turn our mind to fruit and veg that just this week I've got quite a successful fruit and veg farmer from the Currumbin Valley in South Queensland who's here with us for 3 days to exactly address the deficit in training and knowledge sharing. What this fellow David Freeman has done to enhance soil is quite remarkable. And in fact, my colleague here, Richard, went to have a quick visit to him only recently. But the important point about what Freeman is doing, we would like to document that and to further develop some training packages David Freeman's already got, and share them with anyone who's interested. And Richard, having been there, have you got anything to add to what Freeman's doing?
Yeah, one of the things that we need to remind ourselves is as we move into the horticultural space, there's a lot of expectation that the land can produce continually, but every piece of fruit or vegetables that comes off a piece of land has to be, we need to be replacing the nutrients. And David Freeman is an excellent example of someone who's taken over from his father. And he realised that his father was essentially mining the soil that was being used to produce avocados and other fruits in that landscape. And he serendipitously discovered the value of thick layers of compost and mulch that he put under these moribund avocado trees. These trees had sent their roots deeper and deeper into the soil, trying to look for nutrients and survive. And as David was putting all this mulch underneath these trees, the health of the trees just went from goodbye, see you later, we're dying, to young, vibrant, but with an old trunk. It's a really exciting story.
Yeah. So,
Any more?
sorry, Rod.
Got some more questions?
I do. So I've got a couple more. So I've got one from Penny, who's wondering about the potential of getting organic waste from other sources for use on farms. And have you explored this much?
We are aware of that practice in some places. There's a catchment here called Maloon Creek with about 20 odd landowners over a 35-kilometre creek line. And there's one fellow at the head of that creek line, Martin Royd, who puts extraordinary effort into composting, and he's got his local community bringing food scraps and waste. He collects roadkill. He puts wood chips on this industrial scale production of compost, and the impact that's had on his landscapes over the years has really paid a dividend for him. Richard,
there's a number of producers we've come across who are accessing urban waste, green waste, and trucking that tens and hundreds of kilometres to produce industrial scale compost systems. One fellow we came across, he was producing 70,000 tonnes of compost on his own property and putting that out at, I think, 5 to 7 tonnes per hectare in order to restore and rejuvenate the nutrient status of his farm. There are many other examples of the farmers instituting or establishing their own composting business, and none of them have gone backward.
That's really interesting, actually, Richard, because it is something that the communities are looking at. I've got another question. So for small acreage farmers or community parklands or even sporting ovals, could regenerative ag apply?
Look, I think it can, but particularly with reference to all the things you can do to improve soil health, starting from testing what you've got and making improvements based on data, based on facts. The other thing you can do is manage hydration, and there's a lot of techniques to limit evaporation, to limit runoff, to make the best of the God-given rains you've got. And when you think of the diversity of community gardens and sporting grounds across Australia, you know, I can't give you one size fits all, but I think you really have to baseline test what you've got, look at your available water resources and improve them based on a baseline of fact. Richard, have you got something to add?
Yeah, I'd suggest that the urban context is ideally set up for projects looking at permaculture. So you can use trees surrounding urban green space as a way of controlling pests. We can use careful placement of organic fertilizers and more looking at biological production of parkland greenness than industrial chemical.
Well, we're going to have to wind it up there, I'm afraid. It's a pleasure talking to you. The newly appointed National Advocate for Soils, General Michael Jeffrey, I've passed his details on to Nicole. He'd like to address you all one of these days when it suits the organisation. But we wish you well in your endeavours. Please try to use your communities of practice and try to improve your own knowledge as much as you possibly can. There seems to me to be limitless resources out there. And don't be frightened to get onto our website and see what's been done. You got anything, Richard, in closing?
Always be prepared to be adapting to the circumstances which we find ourselves in. We all do it producers do it with the market, but increasing uncertainty with temperature and rainfall across Australia means that we have to be very fragile, very flexible and adaptable in the changing climate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rod and Richard, for your time today. It's been a real privilege having you on. And also thanks very much for your offers to assist the communities in transition. I should mention also, we've got a comment in the chat, Kim Roos from Regen Ag would also like to help. Sorry, can I just get you to flick through the next couple of slides, Rod, there? So I just wanted to mention we've got a couple more webinars coming back. So we've got individuals in the community groups and what they can do next week, so please join us. As we mentioned yesterday, you will actually get a copy of this presentation sent to you, and also it's available on the website. So thanks very much, Rod and Richard. Anything in conclusion?
No.
Great. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye and good luck.
Bye.